In piety towards the gods, I would have you know the chief element is this, to have right opinions about them, as existing and as administering the universe well and justly, and to have set yourself to obey them and to submit to everything that happens, and to follow it voluntarily, in the belief that it is being fulfilled by the highest intelligence. For if you act in this way, you will never blame the gods, nor find fault with them for neglecting you. But this result cannot be secured in any other way than by withdrawing your idea of the good and the evil from the things which are not under our control, and placing it in those which are under our control, and in those alone. Because if you think any of those former things to be good or evil, then when you fail to get what you want and fall into what you do not want, it is altogether inevitable that you will blame and hate those who are responsible for these results. For this is the nature of every living creature, to flee from and to turn aside from the things that appear harmful, and all that produces them, and to pursue after and to admire the things that are helpful, and all that produces them. Therefore, it is impossible for a man who thinks that he is being hurt to take pleasure in that which he thinks is hurting him, just as it is also impossible for him to take pleasure in the hurt itself. Hence, it follows that even a father is reviled by a son when he does not give his child some share in the things that seem to be good. And this it was which made Polynices and Eteocles enemies of one another, the thought that the royal power was a good thing. This is why the farmer reviles the gods, and so also the sailor, and the merchant, and those who have lost their wives and their children. For where a man's interest lies, there is also his piety. Wherefore, whoever is careful to exercise desire and aversion as he should, is at the same time careful also about piety. But it is always appropriate to make libations and sacrifices, and to give of the firstfruits after the manner of our fathers, and to do all this with purity, and not in a slovenly or careless fashion, nor indeed in a niggardly way, nor yet beyond our means. Chapter 31 of the Enchiridion has a primarily, but not exclusively, theological orientation. That is, it has to do with human beings' orientation towards the divine, or towards, in this case, the gods. And Epictetus is going to talk about piety, or in Greek, Eusebius, the right orientation towards the divine. What he's saying here, though, like I said, is only primarily, not exclusively, about the gods. It has to do also with our relations with other human beings, as we're going to see as we go through this. So he says, in piety towards the gods, this is what I want you to understand. The main thing is this: not to worship, not to fear them, any of those sorts of things, to have the right viewpoint about them. As he says, orthos hupolepses, and it's translated here as right opinions. We might also translate that as the correct assumptions about the gods. But it's not just, as we see in this chapter, the correct assumptions about the gods as in, what we think of as religious faith or religious belief. It's also interfacing with the correct opinions or assumptions about everything else. So this is part of a greater totality. What are the opinions that we're supposed to have? He says that they exist and that they administer the universe well and justly, that the universe is fundamentally fair or rational. It may seem unfair or irrational to us from our limited perspectives here, but if we could take a broader view, it would actually make more sense to us. And to have, he says, to have set yourself to obey them and to submit to everything that happens and to follow it voluntarily, in the belief that it is being fulfilled by the highest intelligence. So what he's saying there is we should approach the cosmos, the order of natural things, as if there is some sort of beneficent, just, rational intelligence running the show, because that is what, in fact, the Stoics did believe. They thought that reason ultimately governed everything. And if we don't grasp that, that's in part not because, there's a failure in reason, capital R, but because there's a fault with the limited amount of rationality that we ourselves have, which is a reflection of that greater rationality, but only a reflection of it. So he goes on and he says, if you act in this way, you will never blame the gods, nor find fault with them for neglecting you. This was a very common problem in ancient culture, and you can see it not only in ancient Greek and Roman culture, but you can see it in others as well, and you can see it in religious belief among people who practice particular religions even today, saying, God, why did you impose this upon me? What the hell's wrong with you? You seem to be uncaring. This is unfair. And we can go on and on and on and on. People do, in fact, do this. As a matter of fact, being a religious believer doesn't take away a lot of burdens from people in some cases. In fact, you might wrestle with God, to use a biblical metaphor. So he says, how can you do this? Now notice what he says here. He says, this result cannot be secured in any other way than by withdrawing your idea of the good and evil from the things which are not under our control and placing it those which are under our control and in those alone. Does that have to do primarily just with the gods or with the divine, whatever it is that we conceive of as being transcendent to human beings? Or does it have to do with pretty much everything else across the board? Well, the answer, of course, is that this is a central Stoic doctrine. We saw this already at the beginning of the Enchiridion. We're going to see it running throughout the entire work, that there is a fundamental distinction between things that are in our control, things that are out of our control. The good and the evil lie in what's in our control. The things that are outside of our control are fundamentally indifferent, and we don't really have a stake in them. Now, if we get mixed up about that, then we're going to blame the gods when things don't go the way that we want, because they probably won't go the way that we want most of the time. So he says, if you think any of those things to be good or evil, things that are not under our control, then when you fail to get what you want and fall into what you don't want, it's inevitable. It's inevitable. It's sort of necessary that you're going to blame and hate those who are responsible for those results. So if you know that a human being is responsible for your love life going to pot, and you think that your love life is where good and evil really reside, you're going to hate and blame those people who you think are screwing it up, whether they are or not. If your finances are where you locate your good and evil, even though these are things that are strictly speaking externals and outside of our control, and somebody messes with your finances in any way, whether it's the person who imposes an extra tax on you or some cost at a grocery store, all the way up to the person who controls the economy, if there is indeed anybody who does control the economy, you're going to hate and blame those people. If you think about it in terms of the cosmos as a whole and the opportunities that you're given or the body that you're given, well, then you can blame the gods as well, right? We might blame other things if we're more secular minded. But he says you'll blame and hate those who are responsible for these results. Here's where it gets, very general. This is the nature of every living creature, to flee from and turn aside from the things that appear, key term there, appear harmful. So if we view something as bad, if we view it as harmful to us, then it's natural and rational that we are going to try to turn away from it. That's what it means to have aversion. And we're also going to hate that thing. We're going to say, I don't like the rain because the rain comes in and it makes me wet. I mean, being wet is not really a big problem unless there's some other concerns involved. But some people get quite riled up about that. Likewise, he says, Yeah, it's the nature of every living creature, and to pursue after and admire the things that are helpful or profitable or useful, and all that produces them. So if we think that something is helpful for us, if we think that something is valuable, we're going to not only pursue it, we're also going to have a positive attitude towards it. And this is, as he says, inevitable. This is part of the necessary way in which our minds work. Not just ours, but also those of other animals. So he says, it's impossible for a person who thinks that he's being hurt to take pleasure or to be happy about that which he thinks is hurting him, just as it's also impossible for him to take pleasure in the hurt itself. If something is damaging us, something is damaging the things that we think are good or at least instrumental to goods for us, then we're going to get quite upset. We're going to feel negatively towards those things. So he says, what's an example of this? A father is reviled by a son when he does not give his child some share in the things that to the child seem to be good. And we could think of, silly examples of, you've seen the commercial with the bratty kid in the supermarket who doesn't get the cereal that he wants or the candy and then throws a tantrum. That's exactly what Epictetus is talking about. It's also the kid who, and now we're using kid in a very metaphorical term, the young adult who is not getting from their parent what it is that they want, whether it's attention, whether it's recognition, whether it's the keys to the car, whether it's being, having this paid for or that paid for. If they feel that they're entitled to it and they feel that it's a good, and their parent is standing in the way of that good, even though they love their parent, they will have a natural tendency to be angry at them, to even perhaps hate them, and to say bad things about them. It's similar with the gods, like he says. He gives examples of Polynices and Eidocles. These are brothers, right? And they're fighting over royal power. Can't be shared, or at least they thought it couldn't be shared. We have other classical examples as well from antiquity where power was not able to be shared. We can say the same thing about wealth. We can say the same thing about fame. We can say the same thing about affection, attention. All these goods that we can compete over can become sources of contention and strife. So he says, this is why, to bring it back to the gods, this is why the farmer reviles the gods, and also the sailor, and the merchant, and those who've lost their wives and children. Now notice what he says here. For where a person's interest lies, there is also that person's piety. What is beneficial to that person, or what appears beneficial to them, that's what they're going to have piety about. So if the gods are beneficial to them and give them the things they want, oh, I'm so pious, I'm so happy, I praise you to the heavens, Zeus, the heavens that you inhabit. As soon as it turns, like the farmer who doesn't get the rain, or, some insects come along and blight the crops. What are you doing, you stupid God? Don't you understand that I need things to go this particular way? The sailor who gets blown off course. The merchant for whom, things don't go the way that they're planned out. We could talk about all sorts of things. Anytime that somebody makes a prediction and things don't go that way, they get mad at somebody. They feel upset and they look for somebody to blame. So Epictetus is saying we should learn to wean ourselves away from that kind of orientation. Whoever is careful to exercise desire and aversion as he should is also at the same time careful about piety. And he says that if we're going to get that fundamental distinction right, the other things are going to fall into place. The last things that he has to say in this chapter seem to be somewhat conservative, you might say, or traditionalist. He says, you can go ahead and do religious rituals. It's always appropriate to make libations. Libations are where you'd pour out a certain amount of liquid, whether it be wine or honey or, some other drink, and sacrifices. That is a very important part of ancient Greek religion. And to give of the first fruits. The first fruits are what you harvest first. So if it's, grain, it's the very first grain. If it's actual fruits, it's the first of those. If it's animals, it's whatever it is that you butcher first. And he says to give the first fruits after the manner of our fathers, and to do all of this with purity. Now notice what else he says. He's not saying that there's any inherent benefit or rationality to doing this. It's just, if that's what you do in your society, don't rock the boat. There's no need to be a jerk and, show everybody how enlightened you are by not doing it. Go ahead and do it. If you want to show piety that way, that's fine. What matters is this. Do it all with purity, katharos, in a clean way, and not in a slovenly or careless fashion, nor indeed in what he calls a niggardly way, which means a stingy way. That's an old word that comes from Norse, and we nowadays would say, don't be cheap in doing it. If you're going to participate in religious rituals, do so in a way that shows your commitment, your generosity. Doesn't mean you need to spend an awful lot, but you certainly don't want to be cheap. And he says, don't do it beyond your means, because that's not the point of piety. So you might ask, well, what is the point of piety? To go back to the original discussion that he had, it is to have the right opinions or viewpoints towards the divine and to behave according to those convictions. When you have recourse to divination, remember that you do not know what the issue is going to be, but that you have come in order to find this out from the diviner. Yet if you are indeed a philosopher, you know when you arrive what the nature of it is. For if it is one of the things which are not under our control, it is altogether necessary that what is going to take place is neither good nor evil. Do not, therefore, bring to the diviner desire or aversion, and do not approach him with trembling, but having first made up your mind that every issue is indifferent and nothing to you, but that whatever it may be, it will be possible for you to turn it to good use, and that no one will prevent this. Go then with confidence to the gods as to counselors, and after that, when some counsel has been given you, remember whom you have taken as counselors, and whom you will be disregarding if you disobey. But go to divination, as Socrates thought that men should go, that is, in cases where the whole inquiry has reference to the outcome, and where neither from reason nor from any other technical art are means vouchsafed for discovering the matter in question. Hence, when it is your duty to share the danger of a friend or of your country, do not ask of the diviner whether you ought to share that danger. For if the diviner forewarns you that the omens of sacrifice have been unfavorable, it is clear that death is portended, or the injury of some member of your body, or exile. Yet reason requires that even at this risk you are to stand by your friend and share the danger with your country. Wherefore, give heed to the greater diviner, the Pythian Apollo, who cast out of his temple the man who had not helped his friend when he was being murdered. What's being discussed in chapter 32 might be a little bit difficult to relate to for a present-day audience because he talks about divination. And, we do have forms of divination that people use today, some of them quite ancient, many of them coming to us from various religions of the world. But it's not something that I think a lot of us relate to on a day-to-day basis like would be the case in ancient culture. If we think more generally about what's being talked about, though, I think we can see how this applies to our own life and our own cultures much more easily. What a person is doing in engaging in divination is trying to, you might say, consult the gods, to get a hold of the people or the things or the forces that really decide things and find out what their direction is, what their orientation, what their will is. So you would engage in divination to find out whether you should do something or not do something, how to view things. We do other things, and when we do these, we often place a quasi-religious faith, or even, let's go beyond that, a superstitious kind of attitude towards those, as if they are revealing to us the nature of the forces deciding things behind the scenes. So divination might not be, casting dice before some sort of god and then seeing what the dice say. Divination might be something like seeing what the people think, opinion polls. Or it might be something like taking market sentiment. Or it might be, a bunch of other things as well. So keep that in mind as we're going through this. Epictetus says, really, when it comes down to it, there's some things that you should go to divination for, and then there's plenty of things where you don't really need to do that. You can figure it out on your own, and if you're putting the case before the gods, you're really copping out, because you know what you should do. So let's take a look at what he says. He says, when you have recourse to divination, remember that you do not know what the issue is going to be, but you have come to find this out from the diviner. But if you are indeed a philosopher, you know when you arrive what the nature of the thing is. You understand the basics of the thing. So if, for example, you're trying to decide whether you should be romantically involved with this person or not, you should understand what the nature of romantic involvement is before you start going to, say, a matchmaker and seeing what they have to say about it, or, consulting God in some way, saying, I'm going to pray on it. Well, before you do that, you should understand the nature of what it is that you're talking about. And he says, there's a lot of things where once you do understand the nature, that's going to change how you see it. Here's an example. If it is one of the things which are not under our control, it's altogether necessary that what is going to take place is neither good nor evil. So if it really is something that's not under our control, and we want to be consistent Stoics, we say, well, I don't have a stake in this. I may have my preferences, but that's just a sign that I'm not really committed to this being something out of my control. And if I was being consistent, I would see that whatever it is that the gods want, or the people want, or whatever is behind the scenes wants, things are going to play out the way they are, and it's not going to hurt me or help me either way. So he says, do not therefore bring to the diviner desire or aversion. Don't bring the things that you're already worked up about and then have their hooks in you psychologically. Do not approach the diviner with trembling, but having first made up your mind that every issue is indifferent and nothing to you, but that whatever it may be, it will be possible for you to turn it to good use, and no one will prevent this. Whatever the case is going to be, you have some way of meeting it, and you can turn it to some sort of good use. Even if it's something that we traditionally look at as being bad, like famine, like social disgrace, like poverty. All these things can be turned to some sort of good use. So he says, go then with confidence to the gods as you would to counselors, people whose viewpoints you trust, people who literally can deliberate well. The phrase here is hos epi sumbulus, and then he talks about engaging in we could call it counsel, but we could also call it deliberation. And when we deliberate, we're saying, well, should I do this or should I do this? And we're not just, deciding it on the spot. We're like thinking it through. We're reflecting. Well, if I do this, then this is going to happen, and this is good, but this is bad. And what about this one over here? We think about the trade-offs. We think about what's incumbent upon us. And when we do that with other people who really have, as we say, our best interests at heart and know what they're talking about, we can arrive at much better viewpoints about things. And sometimes when we know what we should do, they can help us to stiffen our resolve to do it. So the gods should be approached in the same way, or whatever it is that we're going to place in the seat of the gods in our own culture and treat as something we can approach through divination. So he says, go to them as you would to counselors. And then after some counsel's been given you, remember who you've taken as counselors and who you'll be disregarding if you disobey. Then he talks about Socrates, and he says, go to divination as Socrates thought that men should do. That is, in cases where we don't know the answer. If you already know the answer, you don't need to go to divination. You're copping out. You're looking for somebody else to make the decision for you. If you know, for example, that you should treat your friend as a friend, and you don't need to go to the gods for that or have some religious text to tell you that. You can figure that out by actually consulting your own heart and your gut and your head, and they will tell you the same thing. Yes, if you're going to be a friend to somebody, there's certain things that you ought to do, right? Here's an example here. If it's your duty to share the danger of a friend or of your country, then don't go to the diviner and say, well, should I do this? Because if you're doing that, you're basically looking for an excuse not to do what you know you're supposed to do. Don't go to the diviner to figure out whether you should be a good brother or a good sister or a good husband or wife. Whatever it is that the diviner tells you, you already know what the answer to that is. Don't go to the diviner to find out whether you should be fair in business dealings. The answer is yes. Don't go to the diviner for all of these sorts of things that, as he says, reason can tell us the answer to, or other skills or arts, other techni. We already have the answers. So he says, if you get an answer and it's something that you don't like, then you're going to get upset. And you don't want to get upset. But reason already tells us what we need to do. Reason, for example, requires that even at this risk, you're to stand by your friend. If you're going to be a friend, then reason tells you if there's certain risks that you have to run, like, getting their back in a fight, or when they're being slandered, perhaps you're being slandered yourself, being a friend requires that. So he says, therefore, give heed to the greater diviner, the Pythian Apollo, who cast out of his temple the man who had not helped his friend when he was being murdered. We learn more by looking at the examples, well, certain examples at least, of the gods. Some of them are quite unedifying from a Stoic perspective, but we learn more by looking at the examples of the gods supporting justice, of the gods supporting temperance, of the gods supporting courage, about the gods supporting and conveying wisdom. We learn more about what we ought to do in difficult situations by looking at those things than we do by going to some murky process by which the will of the gods is going to be exposed to us. If there are things that are totally unknown, then Epictetus says that that's okay. Socrates thought it was fine to go to the diviner for that sort of thing. Epictetus thinks it's okay. We might in the present think that that's irrational. But again, remember, divination here can mean more than just the traditional Greek-Roman conception of going to the gods and finding out answers. We might have all sorts of other ways in which we try to come up with answers as well. But we only need to do that for the things that we don't already know the answers to.